Risa, risa.
All right, more Sanskrit drama. Let's talk a little bit about the history, but really history that's centered around people. Now, this is also a little bit fluid because we have some people that are involved in the historical development of classical Sanskrit drama, but you know, the identities of these people aren't maybe as complete as we would like. Nevertheless, the important figures, to the extent that we can understand them, know them as they are, they're still kind of the framework for what we know of how classical Sanskrit drama develops. So let's start at the very beginning, shall we? Well, it's hard to say exactly where the beginning of classical Sanskrit drama is. Some of the earliest pieces of classical Sanskrit drama are only that. They're only pieces. They only come in fragments. They're not a complete play. And these are from a playwright that we know, as best we know him at all, as Ashvaghosha. 1st century CE, maybe. And again, only little bits and pieces, no complete play from this person. And also, curious to note, seems to have been Buddhist. So for what that's worth, you put that down in your notes, assuming that there's going to be some exam for this lecture. First bits of classical Sanskrit drama seem to be fragments written by this guy named Ashvaghosha, 1st century CE maybe, and seems to have been motivated to have a kind of Buddhist character to it. Well, that's about all we've got of Ashvaghosha. First complete plays come probably from a guy named Bhasha. And those are probably from 2nd century CE, but probably. Now, another curious thing about these plays from this particular playwright is we didn't have them, the plays, until really recently. Kind of surprising considering how important they are as maybe the earliest complete Sanskrit dramas. We didn't have our hands on the actual texts until the early 20th century. They showed up in a library or archive somewhere and got identified. Now, we more or less acknowledge these 13 plays as the work of this person. Seems to have been named Bhasha, probably from the 2nd century. So these 13 plays, they've got a lot of interesting features that speak to the development of Sanskrit drama. First thing we should say is that maybe we can divide them into 3 groups. Not to be too glib about it, 3 Bhasha baskets. One basket are the Mahabharata plays. He wrote 7 of those. 7 plays that have to do with Mahabharata stories. Now, this is not that he simply dramatizes stories that come from the Mahabharata. Bhasha's not averse to changing these stories. I mean, the material, the characters, and the narrative situation and so forth, that comes from the Mahabharata. That inspires, for sure, these 7 plays that Bhasha writes that have to do with Mahabharata. But the stories get changed around in Bhasha's hands, and they come out a little bit different. So that's curious. We've got a writer early in the classical Sanskrit drama tradition who's not too worried about adhering really closely to the narrative tradition that he's interested in. That's not the only narrative tradition he's interested in. Bhasha also gives us 2 plays that touch on the material of the Ramayana. So that's basket number 2. Mahabharata basket over here, Ramayana basket over here, and maybe in the middle is the catch-all miscellaneous basket, in which there are just a few plays that don't have to do with either one of those source texts, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Now, curious among those plays, there's Bhasha gives us a play in which features a character named Charudatta, and curiously, that same character with the same name shows up later in the tradition under the hands of another author, an author named Shudraka. So let's talk about that guy. Shudraka, we know even less about him perhaps than we know about anybody else. We've got his name attached as an author to this play. The play titled Murchakataka, or in English translations often translated as Little Clay Cart. Okay, so we've got Shudraka, he wrote this play. And other than that, we don't really know anything. Now, the author of this play does us a bit of a favor, or what seems to be a favor. In the prologue of this play, the author, putatively Shudraka himself, tells us a whole lot about the author. And so we learn from the prologue to this play that Shudraka, who's writing this prologue, is a really, really, really smart guy. He's very well educated. He's also, faultlessly ethical. He's also courageous, and he seems to have been both a king. Strike that. Both suggest two things, but he's all sorts of things. He's a king, and he's a warrior, and also an ascetic. Shudraka, according to what he writes himself, is a really great guy. Problem comes in that this prologue that Shudraka seems to be reading also tells us that Shudraka lived to be 100 years old, and when he got to be 100 years old, then he threw himself on a sacrificial pyre and expired. I don't know exactly how we reconcile that with Shudraka, the author. That's the nature of classical Sanskrit drama. We just get piles and piles of mysteries that we can't quite sort out entirely. That's part of the fun. So Shudraka, what does he give us? He gives us this play, Little Clay Cart, which is often regarded as maybe the paradigmatic model for one of the two main types of Sanskrit drama. That is Nataka on the one hand, Prakarana on the other hand. This play, the play that Shudraka gives us, is a model of that second type, the Prakarana type. And its characteristics are front and center in Shudraka's play. It's about regular folks. Regular is a kind of a fraught word. I suppose we could say it's about middle-class folks. We got this middle-class guy, Charudatta, who's got middle-class concerns. And the play has a kind of distinct suspicion of authority and power, and people in authority who might exercise power to the disadvantage of the regular folks about which the play is concerned. I think that makes the play really interesting. There's this commentary on a power structure, and maybe coming from outside of that community of people who hold the power. We'll talk about that play and its plot points and all of its other characters in some detail in a later discussion, as well as plays of Bhasha. And we'll talk about at least one of the plays of our next person in the historical trajectory, and that's Kalidasa. Kalidasa is kind of the Sanskrit poet. And he didn't only write plays. We get 3 plays from him, but we also get these a couple of long narrative poems. And Kalidasa is sort of he's the apex of the tradition. He's the guy who seems to have realized the potential of Sanskrit to be poetic in a way maybe that nobody else quite does. He's the poet of the tradition. In the colonial period, you know, when South Asia is a colonial holding of the British, you know, would trot out this analogy and describe Kalidasa when they had to as the Shakespeare of India, acknowledging, you know, this colonial trope that Shakespeare is the greatest thing since sliced bread was invented, or whatever. But this, of course, can go both ways. And in fact, it does, in at least one instance that's, I think, worth noting when we're talking about Kalidasa as sort of the figurehead of the tradition. In the late 19th century, there was an ambitious fellow who decided that it would be a good idea to translate Shakespeare's play Midsummer Night's Dream into Sanskrit. He had a lot of different reasons for doing this, I think. One of the reasons that this particular 19th century scholar poet decides that it'd be a good idea to translate Shakespeare into Sanskrit is that he thinks there's a body of Sanskrit scholars and poets who are really missing out on what's really valuable in English literature. Now, whether or not, you know, he's right about this is what he asserts in the introduction to his own project. But he does something else that's interesting as part of translating Midsummer Night's Dream into Sanskrit. He also transforms that play, Shakespeare's play, into a classical Sanskrit drama. He changes the play in such a way that it looks more like the plays of Kalidasa, the way that the plays of Kalidasa are structured and so forth. And he does this on purpose too. He's the author of Vasantaka Swapnam. This is the title that this author gives to his translation of Midsummer Night's Dream. The author of this play tells us in an introduction that he wants to make sure that he gets Shakespeare in front of these scholars in a way that they'll take it seriously, because he thinks these Sanskrit scholars aren't going to take anything seriously that's not quite as great as Kalidasa. It's got to look like Kalidasa, or else it's not really going to be legitimate. This is a longer detour than really I needed to take, but what this comes down to is the flip side of this antiquated trope that Kalidasa is the Shakespeare of India. What we get from the author of Vasantaka Swapnam is the suggestion to his intended audience that they really ought to take Shakespeare seriously, because Shakespeare is the Kalidasa of the white folks. This is what he says. I find that amusing. He not only says that, but in the dramatic prologue that the author has to compose for his translation so that it looks like a Sanskrit drama, he makes the suggestion that Shakespeare's poetry is so good that it turned his people white. Take that for what you will. So it can flip both ways, right? Shakespeare's the Kalidasa of India, every bit as much perhaps as we might say Kalidasa is the Shakespeare of India. Anyway, Kalidasa gives us these three plays, the most well-known of which is Shakuntala. And like the other two plays, Shakuntala involves a king, courtly life, and a disruption of that courtly life. We'll save the details of the play for a later discussion, but this is actually the kind of formulaic structure for all three plays. Courtly life and a king, and there's a disruption of that life, and the disruption is the consequence of a woman who enters the scene from outside of the structure of the court. Now, what do we know about Kalidasa? Part of this framework, the business of kings and courtly life, what seems to be insider knowledge about the way that court life works in the plays has suggested to some scholars that Kalidasa must have had some firsthand knowledge of this world. Maybe Kalidasa was, one of the kings, one of some kings' courtiers. What else do we know about him? Not much, but we can construe some things. Some scholars have thought that maybe this king that Kalidasa must have been hanging out with, based on some other historical references in the plays, would have been Chandragupta II. That would put Kalidasa maybe in the end of the 4th century CE. And geographically, if that's the kingdom that we're talking about, somewhere in the region that now in India is Madhya Pradesh. There's some appeal to attributing these details to Kalidasa's life, but they're still uncertain, right? Kalidasa is another one of these authors that has an obscure history, and we can probably live with that. I think putting Kalidasa in that 3rd or 4th century is good, not only for historical reasons, but for stylistic reasons that have to do with the Natya Sashtra, which is also going to be a subject of later discussion. So, Kalidasa gives us 3 plays. They have to do with the court life of a king, the disruption of that court life by some woman who enters the whole story from outside of court life. And in all 3 cases, what happens is the disruption gets resolved in a way that reaffirms an unyielding cosmic structure that court life is supposed to manifest. Now, by unyielding, I mean what we find in these plays is that nothing really gets disrupted after all. The disruption that we sense as audience members in these plays turns out only to be the consequence of not really seeing what was going on. And once the play has worked through everything, and once we, the audience, as well as the characters in the play, once we all come to see what was going on all along, we discover that nothing was really ever taken apart, nothing was broken, nothing was disrupted actually. Things were just sort of fulfilling their cycle, coming back to the place of beginning, so as to reaffirm that the universe is constant. The divine cosmic order just is. And we don't have to worry too much about it coming apart. This is the big lesson that characters in Kalidasa's plays learn.
Risa, risa. Risa, risa. Risa, risa.